Welcome to Biology, the scientific study of life. Contrasting views of community structure are the subject of continuing debate. Now that we have looked at various aspects of community structure and species diversity, how can we account for the particular species found together as members of a community? Two different views on this question emerged among ecologists in the 1920s and 1930s, based primarily on observations of plants distribution. We will briefly describe these historical arguments because they are the forerunners of two community models still debated today. Integrated and individualistic hypothesis. In the early 19 years, F.E. Clements of the Carnegie Institute of Washington proposed the integrated hypothesis of community structure. This hypothesis describes a community as an assemblage of closely linked species looked into association by mandatory biotic interactions that cause the community to function as an integrated unit, in effect, as a superorganism. Evidence for the integrated view includes the observation that certain species of plants are constantly found together as a group. For example, deciduous forests in the northeastern United States usually include particular species of oak and maple. United States usually or birch and beech along with a specific assemblage of shrubs and vines. Shortly after the integrated hypothesis was proposed, H.A. Gilson of the University of Chicago enunciated a different view of community structure. His individualistic hypothesis depicts a plant community as a chance assemblage of species found in the same area simply because they happen to have similar abiotic requirements. For example, for temperature, rainfall, and soil type. These two very different ways of thinking about community structure, integrated versus individualistic, suggest different priorities in studying biological communities. The integrated hypothesis emphasizes entire assemblages of species as the essential units for understanding the interrelationships and distributions of organisms, whereas the individualistic hypothesis emphasizes studying single species. Both the integrated and the individualistic hypothesis see communities as involving interspecific interactions. However, they offer different perspectives on how species are assembled into a community. The two hypotheses also make contrasting predictions about how plant species should be distributed along an environmental gradients, such as a gradual change in moisture or temperature over some distance. The integrated hypothesis predicts that species should be clustered into discrete communities with noticeable boundaries because the presence or absence of a particular species is largely governed by the presence or absence of the other species with which it interacts in its group, as shown in this figure. Okay. In contrast, the individualistic hypothesis predicts that communities should generally lack distinct geographic boundaries because each species has an independent, that is individualistic, distribution along the environmental gradients. In other words, each species is distributed according to its tolerance ranges of abiotic factors that vary along gradients, and communities should change continuously along the gradients with the addition or loss of particular species. As shown here, individual in this population densities of individual species. Notice the environmental gradient and such as temperature, moisture. In most actual cases, especially where there are broad regions characterized by gradients of environmental variation, The composition of plant communities does seem to change continuously, with each species more or less independently distributed. As the C noticed that such distributions generally support the view of plant communities as relatively loose associations without discrete boundaries. However, there were some key factors in the physical environment, such as soil type change. Abruptly adjacent communities are delineated by corresponding sharp boundaries. Although such sharp boundaries between plant communities occur rarely in nature, humans have produced many artificial sharp boundaries by altering the landscape through agriculture and forestry. Um, Rivet and redundancy models. The individualistic hypothesis is generally accepted by plant ecologists today, but further debate arises in the application of these ideas to the animals in a community. In 1981, American ecologist Paul and Ehrlich proposed that species in a community are like the rivets in the wings of airplanes. Not all the rivets are required to hold the wing together, but if someone started taking out the rivets one by one, we would become concerned about flying in that airplane. The rivet model of communities reincarnates the integrated model that Clemens suggested for plant communities. It suggests that most of the species in a community are associated tightly with particular other species in a web of life, thus reducing or increasing the abundance of one species in a community affects many other species. In 1992, Australian ecologist Brian Walker suggested an opposing view of communities, the redundancy model. According to this model, most of the species in a community are not tightly associated with one another, and the web of life is very loose. An increase or decrease in one species in a community has little effect on other species which operate independently, just as Gleason had suggested 80 years before in his individualistic model of the plant community. Species within a community are redundant. For example, if one predator disappears, another predator species in a community will usually take its place as a consumer of a specific breed. If one pollinator ceases to visit a particular species of flowering plant because the pollinator has disappeared from the area, another pollinator species will do the job. It is important to keep in mind that the rivet and redundancy models, like the integrated and individualistic models, represent extremes. Most communities probably lie somewhere in the model. So, why is the debate that began early in the 19th century continuing? The main reason is that we still do not have enough information to answer the fundamental questions raised by Clemens and Eggleston. Are communities loose associations of species or highly integrated units? To fully assess the contrasting models, we need to study how species interact with communities and how tight these associations are. For example, how would the impacts on a community differ if the one species lost from it were a keystone species compared to a rare species with relatively little influence or on community structure? Such questions about community structure are important because they underlie many current environmental problems, such as how the extinction of particular species may affect the functioning of ecosystems.